Welcome back to Pen and Reel. I'm your host, Uncle Joel, and let's talk Infinite Frontier. So Infinite Frontier is DC's next big publishing initiative, coming out of Dark Knight's Death Metal and Future State. And this is kind of DC's non-reboot, where they're shifting characters around, bringing in new creative teams, and just generally trying to reignite interest in their books. This is a common trend that both DC and Marvel seem to do every few years. For instance, DC has had 1 year later after Infinite Crisis, and then after the New 52 they had DCU, and then more recently they had DC Rebirth. Really, it's just a way to shake things up, bring in new ideas, and hopefully spark interest in readers. So now, with Future State ended, we dive into the beginning of the Infinite Frontier. We start with Infinite Frontier issue number 0. Now, a quick side note, I always hated when books are labeled like issue number 0, particularly this one when it's the first issue of the Infinite Frontier. However, DC did just announce that there is going to be a 6-issue Infinite Frontier series starting in the summer, which makes this essentially a prelude to that Infinite Frontier series, so I'm a little more accepting of the issue number 0 label. Not that that really reflects on the contents of the book, I just find it annoying when comic companies give these really weird numbering to different books. Marvel's done their .1 and .2 issues and other stuff like that that's just kind of ridiculous. But for this issue, we get essentially a jumping on point that would be really good for new readers, as well as just kind of generally giving you an idea of what the DC universe is going to be like going forward. This is by no means going to be necessary reading, so for instance, if you're just focused on the Batman books, you don't have to read the Batman story in this in order to read the Batman books. However, I would say if you're at all interested in any of the DC books, this is probably a good place to start. Now, this story acts as a bridge between Dark Knight's Death Metal and the rest of the DC Universe books that are going forward, with Future State acting as a glimpse of things that might be coming further down the road. Kind of a hint of things to come. So the story here in this issue is Wonder Woman after the end of Dark Knight's Death Metal, where she is essentially ascended to godhood. She has ascended beyond the mortal plane, as it were. And she begins to get an introduction to the Infinite Frontier, which is what they're calling the DC Omniverse going forward. It is a multiverse without limitation. Not dissimilar to the Infinite Earths prior to Crisis on Infinite Earths, but in a bit more of a grand scope, including things like the linear verse that we just saw pop up recently in Shattered Generations. Wonder Woman encounters the Quintessence, which is essentially a council of the higher beings within the DC universe. These are godlike beings that oversee the DC multiverse and help maintain things going forward. So you have the wizard Shazadam, you have Phantom Stranger, Spectre, Ganthet, you have the goddess Hera, and you have Highfather of New Genesis. So it's a council of these extremely powerful godlike beings, and they want to welcome Diana into the council and have her join the Quintessence. And as such, the Spectre starts taking Diana on a tour of the DC universe and showing her different characters that she knows and where they are going forward. And that's where we get into the individual stories and introductions to some of the upcoming books. And so the first story that we run into is the introduction of Black Adam to the Justice League, as written by Brian Michael Bendis. This is where we see the name Shazadam come into play. Now, there was a post by the website Bleeding Cool that made the claim that DC was going to be changing Black Adam's name to Shazadam, and it was based solely off of early leaks of these pages. And here we just have a few random pedestrians referring to him as Shazadam, which I believe is just them confounding Black Adam and Shazam. Now, Bleeding Cool's claim was that this was going to be Black Adam's name going forward. But personally, I think that was jumping the gun a bit. See, this to me sounds like typical Brian Michael Bendis dialogue. This is just a random citizen misidentifying the person that they're talking about. Now, it's entirely possible that DC is going to change Black Adam's name to Shazadam, but I highly doubt it, especially if it's based solely off of this. Personally, I think he's just going to be Black Adam going forward, and this was Brian Michael Bendis trying to be cute. I would say that this didn't really do a great job of making me interested in reading the Justice League book that comes out of Infinite Frontier. Really, all it did was spark the controversy over the term Shazadam. So I'd say that the Justice League portion is kind of weak, but not poorly written or poorly done. It just didn't really spark my interest in the book itself. Although I am interested in seeing Black Adam as a part of the Justice League, and Brian Michael Bendis proved himself fairly well on the Avengers, so I am curious to see what he does with Justice League, despite my disdain for what he did on Superman. But anyways, we move on from the hints of Black Adam joining the Justice League, and we then shift to Gotham in a story written by James Tynion IV. And this little bit of story here seems to be setting up a number of different things for the Batman books going forward, where we see that it appears that Joker has killed Bane. We get to see Barbara Gordon back in her role as Oracle, talking to the Huntress about the Batgirls, Spoiler and Orphan, Stephanie Brown and Cassandra Cain, making jokes about the Birds of Prey. And then we also get a page with Grifter showing up to Jace and Lucius Fox. And so really this portion of the story is just setting up these different pieces that are going to be played with going forward in the Batman books. I haven't read any of James Tynion IV's Batman runs so far, and so I'm not really that inclined to pick it up now. Seeing what he's done here and having read some of his other work in the past, I would be interested in reading some of his stuff. I just haven't really kept up with it, and I don't really intend on jumping in the middle. I will probably pick up the trades when I can find them on sale later. But I would say this portion of the book is done decently enough. I don't think it does enough to really spark interest in new readers, but I do think it's done well, and I think it shows that he has a lot of plans for the book going forward. And then from there, we shift to Themyscira, in a portion written by Becky Cloonan and Michael Conrad that appears to be setting up Nubia as the new leader of Themyscira, with Hippolyta taking on the role of Wonder Woman going out to man's world. I think this Wonder Woman portion of the book was actually quite strong. It set up quite a bit for Nubia, for Themyscira, for Hippolyta, and it worked really well with only a few pages to set things up and tell an interesting story. Whereas most of the other stories within this book are more just giving teases of what's to come. This actually told a full story in just a short time that was strongly character-focused, really moved the characters and the world forward, and gave you strong hints of what the main book is going to be like. So of all of the short teases here, I would say that this Wonder Woman portion by Cloonan and Conrad was probably the strongest in the book. We then get a brief interlude with the new Wonder Girl, Yara Flor, as written and drawn by Joelle Jones. And the Wonder Girl snippet was fairly simple and straightforward. There wasn't a lot to it, but the art's compelling and the characters do feel well realized. So I'm curious to see what Joelle Jones does with the book when it comes out. A sequence with original Green Lantern Alan Scott talking to his son Obsidian and his daughter Jade, ultimately coming out to them as a gay man. So for this Green Lantern Alan Scott story, I was honestly surprised with it. I have never really cared for taking a character who's been established and been around for decades and changing their background significantly or changing a lot about their character. Doing something like taking Alan Scott, a character who's been around for 80 years, and suddenly making him gay, just feels disingenuous to me. It's taking everything that we've ever known about the character and flipping him on his head. And normally, I don't like it when people do that. It feels disingenuous, it feels like pandering, and it doesn't feel honest. It feels like it's doing it specifically for the company to be seen as being progressive, and it can feel like a lack of care for the material and the characters. However, with Alan Scott, I think it works really well. This is a character who came to prominence in the 40s. Public perception of homosexuality at the time was vastly different, and so it makes sense that he would have kept his homosexuality hidden all of this time. Just because public perception has changed significantly in recent years doesn't mean that he would instantly be comfortable coming out of the closet. This is something that he would be wrestling with for years, and he would have to be coming to terms with it even within himself. And so this is a character development that they could have very easily just flip the switch and all of a sudden, okay, he's gay now. But the way that they're handling it and the way that they're drawing it into his history and the world that he grew up in, I feel is a very strong move, and they're really thinking about it and really going about it in the right way. This is very strong character work that I feel is handling the character with respect and handling the issue delicately and maturely. So yeah, where I was initially skeptical about it, I feel they did a very good job with it, and I'm happy with the development. We then get an introduction to Teen Titans Academy, as written by Tim Sheridan, teasing at the introduction of Red X. And this Titans Academy portion, it didn't really do a lot for me, but I think that's kind of the limitations of the page count, and they're trying to introduce this entirely new status quo. So while it didn't excite me, I'm interested more in the concept than in the presentation here, and I am interested in the concept. A look at Superman is written by Philip Kennedy Johnson, where they seem to be setting up John Kent as this potentially villainous character, or at least a character who might have a villainous turn. And this particular story is focused on the fact that John Kent may not be as noble as his father and may potentially turn into a greatest threat the DC Universe has ever known. This handling of Jonathan Kent, I'm really not happy with. I honestly haven't been happy with the way that they've handled Jonathan Kent since Brian Michael Bendis took over and aged him up and completely changed the character in my mind. And what Philip Kennedy Johnson is doing feels like it's an attempt to course correct, but I feel like he's course correcting in the wrong direction. The John Kent that we had in Super Sons and in the early Rebirth books feels like a completely different character than the John Kent that we have now. Yes, he's older and there is naturally a character progression, but it went from this lighthearted, fun, hopeful character to angsty and potentially a threat, and it just does not feel like the right course for me. I can't necessarily say that it's the wrong path to go down per se, but it's lost everything that I love about the character, and I just don't really have a lot of interest in it anymore. The way this little story was wrapped up, I do feel shows that there is potential for redeeming John. And I do appreciate how Philip Kennedy Johnson managed to tell a full story in such a small amount of pages. But really, focusing so much on this version of John Kent is just not going to interest me, and so I can't really give a fair, unbiased judgment of this story and of the books going forward, because frankly, I'm not going to be happy unless they de-age him. And from there, we get a brief look at Green Arrow and Black Canary as they rekindle the romance, as well as the return of a fan-favorite character. So this Green Arrow story seems really focused on rolling things back and bringing Green Arrow and Black Canary back in line with what fans really love about the characters. This little story wasn't anything phenomenal, but it does give me hope for the character in the future. And then we get a few pages written by Jeff Johns where we reintroduce Stargirl. I was fairly disappointed in this Stargirl story because really this feels just like a concise rehash of the first Stargirl series and the original Stargirl series by Jeff Johns. Personally, I would have preferred to have a little bit more character progression and seeing where she is now, but at the same time, it's been a long time since Stargirl's had her own series, so I understand reintroducing people to this character, especially since a lot of newer readers aren't going to be familiar with her. So I can't really criticize Jeff Johns for writing it this way, and I think it makes sense from a marketing standpoint why they would go this route. It just didn't feel like anything new to me, and it felt like something I've already read, so I personally didn't really get anything out of it. And then we get a glimpse of Green Lanterns as written by Jeffrey Thorne, featuring John Stewart, Simon Baz, and the Teen Lantern. This Green Lantern story I really enjoyed. I was quite skeptical going into it because of some of Jeffrey Thorne's social media activity. He's been very critical of Hal Jordan and has very openly stated that he hates the character. And whenever creators are going to work on a property and they express disdain for some aspects of that property, it always makes me very wary. However, just in the few pages presented here, in the presentation, in the way it's written, and just the concept of it, I do feel like the story has a lot of potential. I'm still a little bit skeptical, particularly if he brings Hal Jordan into the story at all. I do think he'll be professional and will write Hal Jordan appropriately, but still, I'm not really fond of a writer writing a character that he stated that he dislikes, and I'm always a little bit worried of how that's going to be handled. But yeah, after reading this portion, I am very interested in Green Lanterns going forward, and I'm probably going to pick it up as a strong Green Lantern fan. And then we get a sequence of The Flash as written by Joshua Williamson, setting up new roles for both Wally West and Barry Allen going forward. Now, these new roles for Barry and Wally really surprised me. Personally, I thought they were going to have Barry maintain his role as the Flash and have Wally be the one that goes out into the multiverse. But they completely flipped the script on that. Now, that does work for me. I would prefer to see Wally on the Justice League. I want a character that is wisecracking more and is a little bit less serious than Barry as the main Flash. But I felt like Wally's role and his experiences within the multiverse, particularly since he came back into the comics, just had a lot more potential for him to explore the multiverse and be given a new role within DC Comics as a slightly redundant character as the second Flash. Especially with Barry being the source of the Speed Force, it made sense for him to continue as the main character of the Flash. Now, either way they handle it, I'm totally fine with it, because you gotta have both, and I don't think it's going to make that significant of a difference which character plays which role, but it does kind of change the stories that are going to be told. And so while I was thinking of it one way, seeing it play out the opposite way could be interesting as well. So yeah, I'm very curious to see how this plays out and see both of these characters in their new roles. And then finally, after the entire tour, we get to wrap things up with Wonder Woman deciding on what her final role is going to be. And ultimately, she does turn down the Quintessence, but she decides that she's going to choose what her own path is going to be going forward. Although it doesn't really spell it out exactly here, so that still remains a little bit unclear. And then from there, we shift into the Epilogue. Which seems to be introducing this grand new villain, but it's not entirely a new villain. It seems to be a different form of a villain we have seen before. So I have to say, I do like the framework story. I was a bit disappointed with the villain reveal at the end. I do think it's exciting and could be really interesting, especially if it is what I hear other people speculating about. But with how much this entire publishing initiative and this entire issue has been focused on changing things up and introducing new concepts, it was a little disappointing for me to see the villain at the end be someone so familiar. And that's not to say that it is at all bad. I could thoroughly enjoy it, but I really like the sense of expansion and newness that has been so prominent throughout all of the marketing material for Infinite Frontier, as well as just all of the new ideas and new characters that are being introduced in the different books. So since we get so much sense of new, I was expecting something a bit more new and a bit more fresh for the villain here. Now, this may be a new take, and it does seem to be a different take, so that newness may be just within the character itself. But personally, I would have liked to see an original character, a new threat to the multiverse, as opposed to returning to the same well. Continue that sense of expansion that has been so prominent throughout the rest of Infinite Frontier and Future State. But overall, I would say that I really enjoyed this issue. I think it did a really good job of setting up the state of the DC Universe going into Infinite Frontier, as well as igniting interest in the different books going forward. The framing story with Diana was really good at tying into all of the different stories, giving a good reason for presenting a bunch of different stories within this book. I feel like that's one weakness for a lot of books like this, and it's definitely a strength here. And I have to say, this book definitely did its job. This was designed to excite people and draw their interest into DC going forward and all of these different books that are coming out as part of Infinite Frontier. And yeah, it definitely worked for me. It has me excited and interested for a number of different stories, and even the characters that I'm less inclined towards, I'm very curious. If money wasn't a barrier, I would probably read every book coming out of this. So yeah, this is a very strong issue. I'm very happy I picked it up, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the DC Universe in Infinite Frontier. But if you read Infinite Frontier, issue number 0, what did you think? Which of the stories are you the most interested in? How did you feel about the villainous reveal at the end? Let me know down in the comments. I'm really curious to hear what you think. If you could help me out by hitting like, I'd really appreciate it. And be sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss out on the rest of my comic book content. And until next time, this is Uncle Joel saying, stay tangible.